Well, we're getting down to what is the real meat and drink, I suppose, of economic life. And there is nobody who knows more about the labour market in Ireland than Patricia King, the General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Patricia has spent a lifetime working at various levels within the trade union movement and is very knowledgeable about not just any one sector of the economy, but right across the range of public, private, and indeed even the voluntary sectors of the economy. She, I would say, has saved more jobs than any other person in Ireland because she has been involved in some of the most intractable and difficult industrial situations over the years. In her current role as Congress, a lot of what she does goes under the radar. It's a little bit like an iceberg. You see the top, but the whole 90% of the work she does, it probably doesn't very often come to the attention of the country. But you can be assured that if there's any major issue in industry, that she will be involved in it at some level. So she has an extraordinary experience of the labour market, and there is no better person who could recognise the signs of the times for us. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Patricia to give her keynote address.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this afternoon's session. Although I believe after this morning's session, no matter what I say, you're on a downward slide. No matter what you say, I believe the contribution from the President of Ireland was superb this morning. What I decided to do, because I wanted to try and link in with the work that Professor James has done, I wanted to maybe take a tour through what's happening in jobs, but where we're at in terms of employment first in Ireland. So if I can get this to do what it should do. Probably not. Right. So from an overview point of view, there are now 1.9 million people employed, and of that, 325,000 of those people are self-employed, so 1.6 million people are employees in Ireland. And that breaks down in sectoral terms to about 380 in the public service, including the state agencies, 109 in agriculture and fisheries, 250,000 in industry and manufacturing, and 131,000 construction, 509 in retail, and 200,000 in the financial, information, communications, professional and scientific. That's just a broad breakdown of where those people are working. So, if you take the fact that we have one of the highest rates of low pay, so 1 in 4 people, workers in Ireland, earn equal to or less than 2/3 of the median wage. And we also know from our work on the Low Pay Commission that 76,000 workers earn the minimum wage. Now, the CSO don't actually publish that, but they tell us. Jerry and I will be shot down for revealing that secret. But anyway, of the 1.6 million people working, 439,000 of those are in part-time employment in the economy. And interestingly, 36% of them are in the underemployment category. That's up actually from 17% in 2009. So that's an interesting feature. People wouldn't necessarily expect to see that, but that's where it's at. And half of all low-paid workers are part-time, and a quarter of all low-paid workers are less than 20 hours a week at work. So there has also been a dramatic increase in the number of families in receipt of FIS, which effectively, the family income supplement and the social transfer, and effectively, from our perspective, that is the state, in a lot of cases, propping up the incomes arising from low pay. So if we just take a quick look through the sectors. So we have certainly, following the recession, we have now got a smaller public service. Not much smaller, but a smaller public service. And if you are, what has happened to the jobs in the public sector? Well, actually, Every employee in the public sector now earns less money for doing more and for working longer hours, at the very least. So the terms and conditions in the public sector over the last 8 years, on foot of the recession, has quite transformed work in the public sector from an employee point of view, and that's a fact. Some low-hour contracts operate in the public sector. It's by no means a trend, but it's certainly some low-hour contracts operate in it. And actually, they have low-pay features as well. And you often hear when people are trying to maybe have a political point or something like that, they'll say, well, you're talking about the living wage. When is the government going to introduce a living wage? The lowest point actually is a local authority operative. Their starting rate is $9.51. That's what they start on. So that's the lowest rate of pay that's paid from that. Cleaners, security people, the JLCs operate. So that's the sort of level of pay you're talking about in low. But it's by no means, in fairness, the majority piece in the public sector, but there has been a transformation of the pay terms and conditions. So where jobs are at, where we're at in the public service is there's a restoration of pay in process at the moment, commonly referred to as the Lansdowne Road Agreement, and all of you will know from the public outings and that there have been lots of difficulties in the course of that. It is there till 2018, and of course from a trade union perspective, our perspective on it is it's not going to last till 2018 in the sense that you're going to have to accelerate some of the pieces in this because public servants are, and particularly young and people who have entered the service in the last number of years, they are particularly badly hit in all of this. It's a highly unionised sector. There is a collective bargaining understanding and agreement, and that's how they do the business. Outsourcing is referred to and to some degree controlled in the collective bargaining agreement, not entirely, but it's you often get some senior public servants who get a rush of blood to the head and they think they can outsource and off they go, and you have to pull them back into the terms of the agreement. But at least we succeeded in getting that. We have a no compulsory redundancy clause, hard fought, hard got in the first collective agreement during the recession, but there it is, it's in there. I suppose it's not so much frightening, but it's certainly, I would think we'll have to watch. There's a trend now in some cases to build in self-employment contracts into the public sector. Not a good move from our perspective. So if you have a look at agriculture and fisheries, there are clusters of low pay in it. There is a joint labour committee in operation, for instance, in the mushroom industry. Recent revelations of happenings in and developments in the fishing industry, you would all have seen and remember that last year, where not even the minimum wage was being paid and people were actually in some cases grossly exploited by employers in that, where the rates were below the national minimum wage. Not a high unionised sector at all, and for reasons that would probably be obvious to everybody. Now, if we have a look at industry and manufacturing, you could divide it into two, because you have the strong FDI presence in manufacturing. And I have to say, every time I come into this building and I walk along those corridors, I get the shivers, because this is where we did the settlement for Bosch and Lomb. And we spent, Paddy Kavanagh, he was there as well. I hope you get the same shivers, Paddy. And we were, I think, 49 hours walking up and down those corridors, and eventually we got there. But anyway, and that was 1,200 jobs, well-paid jobs in Waterford. But there's a strong, and the main, they're in chemical, pharma, medical devices. They are generally unionised. They have collective pay agreements. They pay well. They have good conditions. They are as insecure as FDI is generally, and we know that. There's sometimes people would say, from an IDA perspective or an Enterprise Ireland perspective, whichever, they would say there's about a 30-year span. Some of them have surpassed that, some of them don't even get to the 30-year span, but there's a strong FDI presence. So the high-tech industry, which is not unionised by and large, in fact, in some cases, in some of the bigger ones, openly hostile to unions, they have individual performance pay models. This is where they agree with individuals what their pay is. and you cannot tell the person sitting beside you what you get paid, and it's a very individualistic. They in some cases they take the American model of paying well and setting some good conditions to keep us outside the door. In other cases they do the opposite. So there's a trend going on there, but it's very much, as I say, individual performance pay models. And they have this now in the last number of years, the ICT-based mobile work, whereby by virtue of the work they're involved in, you can work anywhere at any time supported by new technology. So they have that. There is another feature of industry and manufacturing which is very much linked into the SME sector, which is quite a strong population of people working in companies under 50 employees, not all, but certainly not highly unionised, and quite strong difficulty in getting collective bargaining arrangements. In construction, the story in construction is the levels of employment in construction in 2007 were 281,800. It fell in 2009 to 96,000. And it is now on the way up heading 121,000. And you had a registered agreement which meant that the rates of pay were set by agreement, and that agreement was registered and had to be implemented by law. And during the course of 2012, the employer side went up to the High Court and followed on into the Supreme Court, and the good justice system said to them, "You're right, lads, that is all unconstitutional, you don't have to be paying those wages at all." So the registered employment agreements fell, and the pay rates declined as a consequence of that. There is no onus as we speak in the construction industry to pay unless you have a collective agreement with the employer. So there's no sector. However, on foot of legislation that we campaigned and achieved, a sectoral employment order is achievable, and actually the unions and the employers are in the process attempting to, it's not done yet, Tom, sure it's not, but they're attempting to close that off. Now, a big feature in construction is bogus self-employment. And James will go into that in more detail because his study shows that up. But effectively, it is where under Irish revenue law, and we went up and we checked this with the chairman of the revenue commissioners not that long ago, and they are allowed to effectively, a contractor can designate an employee as a self-employed person. But they don't have to have actually the normal features of self-employment at all. What does that do for the employer? It means the employer actually has no real liability in relation to any of the employment law. It means the PRSI, all of that sort of stuff. There's an awful lot less PRSI paid into the state, so it's very advantageous for the employer. Ultimately, it's very disadvantageous for the employee. So, now there are other forms of self-employment, bogus self-employment, which we'll go into a little tiny bit later. So you can see those figures there. In the 5 years of 2009 to 13, direct employment in the construction industry fell by 41,700 and temporary employment rose by 44%. So you can see what's going on there in the jobs in the construction industry. Now, if we look at retail, accommodation and transport, and the CSO groups the three of these together. And you will all know that traditionally these are low-paid sectors. And the national minimum wage features strongly in these sectors. And the joint labour committees, because we argued and sought and achieved with the last government the reinstatement of the joint labour committees, and they would, for those who are not that familiar with them, that's a process whereby you can go in and agree collectively a rate of pay, a rate of overtime and so on for that particular sector. And you have to get both sides agreeing to do it, but you can come out with an employment regulation order which can be quite valuable to the employees. And for instance, if you take cleaners, contract cleaners, we have it done there, and if you take security, people who work in security, they are all covered by employment regulation orders that the trade unions have agreed in the last year since the legislation was reinstated. But the hospitality sector, the retail employers, they refuse to participate. Now, in hospitality in 2009 and 10, some of the companies in hospitality were in a bad way. But that has, for instance, in the hotel industry, that has reversed completely. You can't get a hotel room in this town at the moment. Yet we have 9% VAT, very favourable VAT level, which is about 350 million foregone in tax to the state. And it's now, if anybody can tell you between 2011 and now that they got a cheaper meal in a hotel or a restaurant because the VAT was reduced, I can tell you you'd have to go around a long time looking for that sort of a person. They pocketed the money, that's what happened, and they regard it as an extremely valuable. I see the construction industry are looking for the same thing. Your man won't build a house until someone gives him the 9% VAT, and that's the reality of that. But anyway, low contracts, if and when contracts, all that precarious work, very commonplace in that. You have a big transitory employment in that people leave, they don't stay long in this industry. In a lot of cases, very bad conditions. They're not expected to have a long relationship with the employer. So the employers get into that mode. That is part and parcel of what happens in that industry. In transport, there is some horrendous in the Now, we were lucky because the Apprenticeship Council was set up, in the last 2 months we've agreed an apprenticeship for HGV drivers, which we hope will help to curtail some of the bad practices. But if you went down the port here any night and you had a look at the list or the long trail of lorries waiting to get in, you will find some of those lads, and they are mainly male, have been sleeping in their trucks so that they can get for the next shift to go into the port and so on. Dreadful practices in some cases. Very low in safety terms as well, I might add. Part-time employment, as I say, is widespread in it. There's a high female participation, mainly in hospitality and retail, and there's low unionisation. Now, we have in the financial information communications and the professional scientific, actually, you have two things again going on here. You have high skill and high pay in some of those sectors, and you have clusters of low pay. And even in the professional and the scientific, for instance, just to take that, in universities, you can have very bad contracts offered to research people in universities, very low hours, bad hourly rates, no security of tenure, all that stuff. So that's going on there alongside this high. And you will also see, you've often heard, even in the last number of years, even at the worst of the recession, some of the high-tech companies crying out for people to come and work with the skills that they require. So that they allow the market to set what the rates would be, and in some cases the rates are very high. There's high unionisation in some areas. The banks are highly unionised, the insurance companies are highly unionised. That's what I mean by high unionisation there. And in others, there's no unionisation at all. They also practice the ICT mobile work. They have, for instance, we all know about the Big Four. Well, the Big Four, for instance, have firstly, they have unpaid interns as a practice, and the other thing they have is they regulate themselves their own traineeship schemes. And anybody who even has put their foot dip your toe into the water of that, you will hear youngsters going in there, and some of the operations are very below par in terms of standards and qualities and so on. We've been arguing very strongly that a lot of that should be covered by apprenticeship, which puts in standards, and we're winning that battle. We have now the accounting technician, we have 3 new ones going into the financial services unit, so it's going to start eating away at that sort of practice. Bogus self-employment. Now, there's a different practice here in terms of, say, for instance, the journalists, newspaper industries, and indeed communications generally. They have a terrible practice in some cases of employing people on low wages, assigning them as self-employed, and then deciding that they will dictate what their terms and conditions are, when they come to work, how many hours they have to work, and so on. There are other practices as well. And so, this is a highly unpopular thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. It never stopped me before. You have, say, some very highly paid people in the communication industry, and they are actually under the bogus self-employed, we believe, setting up their own what's personal services company or a management services company, whereby they're not directly employed by the person who's actually paying them, but they have a filter. And that filter can be either a company for whom they don't have contact with the directors, or it can be a husband and wife, and so on. Now, you'll see some of that. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. They're regarded in their own parlance as talent, and this is how they have to be paid. That's what they call themselves. They call themselves talent, and they're paid multiples of hundreds of thousands of euro, and that's how it happens under this bogus. Actually, the BBC, Osborne's not all bad. He put a provision into his budget this year in March for the BBC to stop that practice, because some of the people in the BBC were being paid enormous sums of money under that, and it was public companies shouldn't be doing it. Anyway, if you look then at private sector high pay, and it's not a subject, as I say, that's often discussed, and we have established in Congress that they have a template, and here it is. They pay themselves a basic pay, which they call their salary. So if anybody asks them, what are you earning, they're able to quote a not enormous sum of money. It'd be enormous to a lot of people, but not necessarily an enormous. But then they have a bonus. Now, the bonus tells them that it can be more than 100% of their salary. The long-term incentive plan is another piece, and God bless them, they can only reach 100% of their salary on that. They're not allowed to earn any more on that, and then they can have a pension of 10 to 20%. You can see some of the examples there. CRH pay 7.8 million to their CEO, and 5 of the directors 5.5 to 5.58. You see, I had to put in the Irish Continent, my man in the Irish Ferries, he got 101.5 million in 2014. Glanbia, she gets 1.6 million, Paddy Power 1.4. The Grafton, in their annual report, they tell us that he gets 1.23 million, and the average wage is 26,600, which by my reckoning, it's 48 times what, and that's the average. So you can imagine there's a good few more working in it that are lower. So what's happening here in our judgment is it's in line with the global trend, which James will go through. Reagan and Thatcher had this so-called liberalised economy model, and they produced systematic inequality in the labour market. Globalisation, new technology, increased demand for high-skilled workers and lower demand for skilled ones. This is all evident in what I've just described to you. And globally, middle-income jobs are being hollowed out, and it's either the high-paying ones or an expansion of the low-paid in the services sector. So the causes, as we know, of inequality are complex. I would believe the capitalist philosophy is to minimise the distribution of the wealth to workers, and they determine, actually, whether we like it or not, they determine how much people will earn into the future and how they will live, and will they have a decent wage, and will they have a good pension, and will they have a roof over their head. And actually, they understand that message an awful lot better than because they're driving it. And from our perspective then, they promote those tools. They promote the zero-hour contract, the low pay, the bogus self. They promote them as tools to achieve. And in fact, they utilise, you saw in the recent Cleary's debacle, one of the worst demonstrations of what they can do. And RTE actually did a documentary whereby some of us can recall a good solicitor coming onto it, and what did he say? They didn't do anything wrong. That's capitalism at work. So that's what they were doing. And he was right. In fairness, they didn't break the law. That's the worst form of it happening. So they also believe that state intervention and social transfers are the state's problem, and the state should be doing it and should be intervening, and any issues of poverty or low pay, it's up to the state to alleviate that. And they control the narrative. You might, I mean, as a trade union official, I can tell you, anybody in this room who's a trade union official will know, the job you have to, and the rigmarole you have to go through if you want to get your message out. Why? Because they don't want to mediate our message. Why do they not want to mediate it? Because if workers actually were able to join up the dots, they might try and do something about it. So that's why they don't want to mediate it. So in Ireland, we're coming towards the end of this. In Ireland, we've no right to collective bargaining, but we have our trade union recognition, and that's why some of the outings we've had of hostility in relation to trade unions, the Dunn Stores dispute would be one, but there have been several others. All of that is allowed in Irish law. But we did achieve, with the last government, in achieving reform, and that those negotiations had gone on. Myself and David and others were involved, a team of people. Mainly, I have to say, eventually Jed Nash and the Labour Party delivered that Industrial Relations Amendment Act in 2015, and that provides sectoral employment orders. They are a very useful pathway. In my opinion, I have to say, a lot of people don't even understand how useful they are. I was glad that a certain senior government minister didn't understand how useful they were either, because he agreed them eventually. And so from that perspective, they are, to me, a useful method. And the JLCs, if they were utilised, would be also for improving people's pay. We have to have legislative amendments for the organisation to try and get the banded hours contracts, to try and deal with the company law piece that Cleary's threw up, to try and deal with the bogus self-employment. Now, you saw the Labour Party recent motion, you saw it coming through, so maybe actually there is a window of opportunity in the current Oireachtas setup that we could actually get into a place where we could maybe change some of the law and improve these circumstances. So my final slide is, if we were to imagine in the low pay area that we had a high trade union density, and unfortunately at the moment all we can do is imagine that, but if you did that, you would see that the industrial leverage alone would force these issues to be resolved. And this accounts for the massive opposition, in my opinion, by the other side to any reform. So if we were able to produce the industrial leverage, which says, you're not going to do this to us actually, because we're going to make sure you don't. And we have that experience from sectors who have high industrial leverage. They are able to do it. So if you had it, you'd be able to very swiftly, in my parlance, deal with the low pay issue. The trade union members are not usually in the low pay category. That's a fact as well. Jerry and I know that as commissioners on the Low Pay Commission. We know that they're not in the low pay area. And changes to the trade union structures are tortuously slow on occasions. However, the sectoral employment orders allow us to organise labour, and they do provide an avenue for some of the answers on this. So the challenge for the trade union movement is to build the population of organised labour, and then we can beat them. Thank you very much.